Hello everyone, it's Olivia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm finally back with another video for my IGCSE series. I'm really sorry it's taken me so long to get around to making this video. I've gone through the anthology for the different texts on the IGCSE syllabus, and I'm going to try and work my way through them. Today I'm going to be talking about Maya Angelou, and I'm sorry if I pronounced her name wrong, but Maya Angelou and her poem Still I Rise. It's a beautiful poem, it's a powerful poem, it's an amazing poem. I'm in love with the poem, basically. Before we get started, I'm going to just read a bit of her author context. Like I've said on my other videos, I think it's really important to point out the fact that because this poem is in the fiction category, author context is not necessarily always important, but I think sometimes it can help you to know about a poet in terms of what they stand for, what their beliefs are, to kind of help you see themes or patterns or correlations in their poem, just to kind of give you a sense what their poetry might be about. If you're someone who struggles to read poetry, it can be really helpful to look into the poet a bit more to sort of see kind of what types of things they might be writing about. But that's obviously not to say if it's in the fiction category you cannot make comments such as oh, this poem is reflecting the poet's actual personal life, because you don't know that for certain unless they explicitly tell you that. And I guess in a way it's just kind of to give you a starting point to sort of grow your ideas from. So Maya is an American poet. She's a writer, she's a singer, she's a composer, actor, director, lecturer, and civil rights activist. And obviously the civil rights activist part is very important because she's a very important figure in Black literary tradition and in literature. And her themes often centre on racism, family, women, and identity. So these are some of the key themes that might crop up in Still I Rise. And the whole idea of her being a singer or composer kind of gives you a sense that her poetry is going to be very lyrical. It's going to employ sound devices or structural sound devices, which I'll talk a bit about later. But first, I just need to get up the poem that I have saved. Okay, I'm going to read the poem out first, and I've written down notes already, but I'm going to read the poem out first. So, Still I Rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise, up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise, into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Oh, I love that poem so much. It's so powerful. But before I get into each kind of stanza to give you some starting points or ideas or things that just kind of personally jumped out to me about the poem, I'm just going to give you 3 little pieces of context that were in the notes in the actual anthology. So the first one is that the idea of oil wells it talks about how in the 19th or in the 19th and early 20th century, the discovery of oil led to the rapid growth of the petroleum industry, which became an integral part of US economy. So we can see that these oil wells are going to be a symbol of wealth. The gold mines, that has connections to like the California discovery in 1848, the period of panning and mining for gold, and like the Great Gold Rush, and like everyone heading west in search of a better life and a more prosperous life. And then the huts are a reference to slaves, like accommodation on plantations. And just before I start getting into like the different stanzas in the poem, this is something that I've kind of been looking into a bit more for university. So one of the reasons why I haven't had time to make these videos is because second year of uni has been quite intense so far. And one of the books that I had the absolute pleasure of reading was called The Long Song by Andrea Levy. And that's about the like Jamaican cotton plantations, and it's fiction, but it's written by a former slave called July, and she's amazing. And it kind of really solidified this whole idea of like how important in Black culture the oral tradition is. So orality, the act of speaking and using your words, is going to potentially resonate throughout this poem. And as I was reading this poem, I just thought it's such like a mantra. It's like this like narrative voice, like sharing their belief in a really powerful way. So those are just some of the sort of initial ideas that I got when I read this poem. So with the first stanza, you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. So clearly this is our introduction to the narrative voice, and from the third line to the fourth line, there's enjambment, which is almost like this refusal to be stopped. It's like a refusal. It's a refusal to be like, you may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. People are sending me messages and they need to stop. The imperative you may, I think it's such a playful contrast. And this is why, once again, it kind of reminded me of the long song. There's this kind of, there's a juxtaposition, so an opposite that's created between what is written down and what is being said by the narrative voice. So what the narrative voice is talking about is negative to begin with. So it's like, you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. That's a very negative thing to have happen to someone. That is talking about like defamation and talking about lying about someone, and the kind of idea of identity, like it's not just affecting this narrative voice, it's affecting their people. And it's just how there's this juxtaposition that switches with like an imperative is a commanding use of someone's voice. If you use an imperative like, you will do this, you should do this, like that's an imperative. You're telling someone, you're instructing someone to do something. That's in juxtaposition to the actual, like what's being written down as negative, but this person is in control because they're saying, oh, you can do all these things to me, but it doesn't matter because still, like dust, I'll rise. Which I love how, sorry, I keep getting loads of pop-ups like on my phone, which doesn't help. There's this transformation of the traditional symbol of dust, which is something insignificant, or dust can make you think of like decay and or just ancient things in general are covered in dust. I love how there's this transformation of this traditional symbol being turned from something insignificant into something significant. It's like a really powerful image that strikes you and stands out. So that's... Do I have more for that? Do I have more for this? No. Okay, so that was kind of for the first stanza. The second stanza, does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. So reading this again, like my kind of initial thoughts, I kind of went down a different route with this bit. I think it can be interpreted, well, actually, I shouldn't say one or two ways because that's not correct. You can interpret literature in many, many different ways, so long as you can base your evidence carefully on the text. You can share like alternative ideas. But my sort of initial impressions of this is that there's kind of like a subtle nuanced sadness to what the narrative voice is talking about. But reading through it again, I can also see that it's being used in a positive, almost ironic way. So I'm going to talk about my initial thoughts first, and then the new ones that have just come into my head I'll share. So there's this, my initial reaction to this stanza was that there seems to be an invasion of personal space, a sense of past troubles, almost like a very accusatory rhetorical question. And the idea of a rhetorical question is showing this narrative's voice's resilience once again. If you use a rhetorical question, you're not seeking a response. You're not asking a question to get an answer back. You're just stating something, but you don't want an answer because you're not interested in an answer. So it's interesting how they use a simile, because I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. So clearly this person doesn't necessarily have the wealth of oil wells, but they're walking like they've got that. So that's why I kind of personally, when I first read this, it kind of gave me a sense that there's this past trouble or there's this sadness. Maybe, obviously, this narrative voice doesn't explicitly, well, they do later on, but they don't explicitly state what their race is, but you just kind of gain this sense that there's this underlying sadness, like maybe they've never been allowed to be a part or been able to access wealth. So that's why they walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. But it's kind of like this active verb. It's like very laborious, like they use the verb pumping in my living room. But it's kind of like that invasion of personal space, like their work life or the work life that they never had. It kind of invades their, like, it's like this juxtaposition between oil wells and they're pumping in your living room. So, but where it's a simile, the narrative voice doesn't have this. They don't have wealth, but they walk like they've got oil wells pumping in my living room. So there's also a sense of pride. But it's just a really interesting kind of stanza to unpick. There's like so much you could like delve into with that one, but that's kind of just some of the ideas I had. But my initial reaction was that there seems to be this kind of very subtle, nuanced sadness to the fact of like this juxtaposition between their image, like even in their own personal home, even if they don't have lots and lots of wealth, they obviously clearly have a home if they have a living room, but then it's kind of almost like this invasion of personal space. So there is a kind of sadness there. They're being very prideful and proud and saying like, I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. But you can tell that there's just something not quite entirely happy with that. Or you may disagree, which is completely fair, because that's what I love about literature. It's all about debating and sharing your own thoughts, and that's why I love it so much as a subject. The next third stanza, so just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. So this is, there's a lot of use of assonance in this passage. And assonance is a sound device. It's spelled ASSONANCE. And assonance is a sound device, structural device, that is related to the vowel sounds. So our vowel sounds are A, E, I, O, U, are our 5 vowel sounds. And when you have them in a poem, because poetry, not all poetry, but the majority of poetry itself is an oral form, it's a performative piece of art. So whenever you read a poem aloud, I always encourage people that you should read poems aloud, because you get so much more meaning. Really pay attention to how it sounds. So for this stanza, the assonance of the vowel I matches the imagery. So just like, because when we say I, it lifts our tone up, so we're physically being lifted up. and it matches the imagery of what the narrative voice is trying to say. So just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll write. It's like it's lifting, it's matching what the narrative voice is speaking, and it's very powerful. And it kind of once again drives home this point of the narrative voice is so desperate to be resilient. They're like constantly repeating, they're constantly driving this point home that no matter what you do to me, you're not going to beat me down or discredit me or do anything, because I'll just always rise. And it's really powerful, and it's such a good poem. Such a good poem. So for the next one, oh, and I've also noticed I haven't really been talking about like the punctuation in here. So there's caesura, which is when you have a piece of punctuation in the middle of the line. There's also a lot of end stop lines, but I think I've talked about those types of techniques in my other videos, so I won't have time to go into everything, because literally we would be here for hours. I'm already at like 16 minutes long, but there's just so much to unpack with poetry, and it's just, oh, I love it. So the next stanza: did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? I don't know, because of the way the anthology is done. I think this is still the same stanza, so I'll read it just in case. Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. So for the first part, once again, this is kind of the idea of like, it's a repetition of like the use of rhetorical questions. So the rhetorics mean that the narrative voice is not seeking a response. They're not interested in what we have to say, because very interestingly in this poem they use direct address, because they like, you may, and you might do this, and it almost places the reader in the position of this imaginary, not imaginary, but the narrative voice antagonist. They're clearly addressing someone or something that has wronged them, and they're placing us as the reader in that position. So we can really sense their resilience and anger and their defiance, and saying, you may do all these things to me, but it's not going to matter. This is interesting where it switches. So in the previous stanza we had a lot of emphasis on the assonance of I, but in this particular stanza it switches to O, and the vowel O obviously makes our tone go very low, and it's a very mournful sound. So in the beginning it's like, did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, and like shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Like it's almost like a lamentation, like there's a sadness to it. But then what I love is that it switches almost with like a mini volta within the next set of lines in this same stanza. So a volta is a change of emotion within a poem, and it switches with the, after the does my haughtiness offend you, it's like, don't you take it awful hard, which I love the kind of dialect, the kind of rough informal dialect of that. It's very powerful. It's very authentic. It feels very authentically spoken, and it's like, I know I keep going back to this, but the long song, July used a lot of Jamaican dialect, and it adds humour to like what is a very horrific and like soul destroying tale. It's a very very powerful book, but very, very sad at the same time. And it's kind of like this strength of voice, like this narrative voices, they're not putting on airs and graces, they're not ashamed of who they are, and that's kind of like almost like a bit of a playful irony that they use quite a sophisticated word such as haughtiness, and then they instantly switch to don't you take it awful hard. It's like playing with tone, going from formality to being really informal, and I just think that's really powerful. And the simile, what am I on about? Where is it? The simile. Oh yeah, because once again we've got the repetition of similes. So because I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. Once again, this narrative voice, we can really gain the sense that they do not have wealth, but to some extent they've got some kind of happiness, because they do not literally have wealth, but they have happiness, and once again that's showing their resilience. And then we go on to then we go on to like another stanza of imperative. So you may shoot me with your words, and sort of like, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. So this is a really important use of caesura. So we have the end stop lines, which is almost like a barrier to each line. It really makes you focus on it. So you may shoot me with your words, then we have to stop. You may cut me with your eyes, then you have to stop. But then when we get to the last line, but still, then the caesura comes in. So it's but still, comma, like air, comma, I'll rise. It's so powerful. It's like caesura is like, it's such an emphasis. It's such a powerful tone that's created because of the caesura. It really makes you sit up and pay attention, because it's like, but still, like air, I'll rise. And once again, we get the I assonance coming in with that final line of like, still, like air, I'll rise. It's just so clever. It's really clever. Obviously, don't write that in your essay. Well, obviously write that in a more formal way. It is a very playful poem, and it's just, I know I'm gushing over this poem, but it's very good. And then we go to the next. Oh, I think, have I skipped a stanza? Imperatives. Oh no. And just still on this stanza, sorry, the imperatives is kind of like the very ostracized imagery that's being created. So it's a lot of is this idea of like they're being separated from society. Like, you may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness. So it's more like emotional, not abuse, I can't think of necessarily the right word, but it's almost like it's a combination of verbal and non-verbal harassment that is taking place. Like, you may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes. So even if someone is just looking at this narrative voice in like a kind of disdainful way, they don't care, because they're like, I can rise above this, I can be better than you, and it's not going to impact me. So it's kind of, that's it. It's kind of like playing with the idea that someone is using imperatives, they're controlling this situation, and it's in juxtaposition to the very sort of kind of ostracized imagery we're getting. So even if people are being horrible to this narrative voice, they don't care. They're like, it doesn't impact me. I think I skipped the next stanza because I couldn't really think what to say about it. The I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs. I guess once again it's kind of just playing on that idea of simile, and that idea of like, they do not have wealth, they do not have literal wealth, but they have self-worth, which is more important to them. And then we get to the next stanza. Out of the huts of history shame I rise, up from a past that's rooted in pain I rise. And this is where the enjambment comes in. Like, there's no end stop lines here. It's literally all of that is enjambment. And then this bit, I'm a black ocean leaping in wide, which has got a caesura, leaping in wide, and then that's an end stop line. Welling and swelling I bear in the tide, and that's an end stop line. So this is the part where the rhyming couplets, so we've got shame, pain, not wide and tight, but shame and pain, they're interrupted by I rise, which is really emphasizing their strength. And because it's enjambment, it's flowing, and they're like an unstoppable force. And the metaphor, this is really interesting. So all throughout this poem, and this is how you get high marks when you talk about poetry or literature in general, think about all these individual images and what it's building up to. If you can pinpoint and give a bigger picture of a poem and say, these different techniques are having this impact on us, this is what it's trying to do, this is what this poem is showing us, but then you're building up to a bigger image. If you can notice changes, if you can notice similarities, differences, these are all the type of things that will give you high marks. So once again, throughout this poem, we've had all these similes. Suddenly we have our first metaphor, I'm a black ocean. And that's very significant because it's embedded with racial identity. So all along the similes have been like, I laugh like I've got this, I laugh like I have wealth, but no, we suddenly get this metaphor and it's like, I'm a black ocean. And even though a metaphor, it's interesting, once again, it's like I said, this poem is very playful, and playfulness is a very interesting thing to look into when you're looking at a piece of work. So they're playing with the idea of a metaphor, because a metaphor, like a simile, it's a comparison. It's not literal, it's not actually occurring, but we can kind of gain from the other evidence in the text, such as the reference to huts, which are like slave huts that slaves would horrifically live in during the time of slavery and all that rubbish that occurred in the past. It's kind of playing with that idea that they're embedding it with their racial identity, but they're using a metaphor to say what their racial identity is, and it's just so powerful. It's just amazing and so clever, and I can't love this poem enough, really. And then for the final set of, where is it? Oh, and once again we've got the leap in wide, so the assonance of I, it's like lifting up again. Then the final stanza of, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. And once again, this beginning bit, we don't have any end stop lines. It's literally just, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. Then it's an end stop line. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. So once again, we've got another metaphor, and it's kind of confirming their identity. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. And then I rise, I rise, I rise, which ends with a lovely use of enjambment. So once again, it's that repetition to drive the message home, and it's to emphasize that, you know, I will rise, I will keep rising, I will keep overcoming any barriers you put in place. And the enjambment backs that up, because they're not being stopped. And it's interesting, actually that's an interesting point. It's interesting how it ends. This poem ends with an end stop line. It ends with a full stop. And I know I've been using all these terms and stuff a lot, but an end stop line, just to remind people, is an end stop line is a piece of punctuation that occurs at the end of a line in a poem. So long as there is a piece of punctuation, it could be a bracket, it could be a question mark, so long as there is a piece, full stop, comma, if there's a piece of punctuation at the end of a line in a poem, that is an end stop line. And end stop lines are very significant. All punctuation in poetry is significant. This poem itself ends with an end stop line. So we've just had this beautiful use of enjambment of I rise, I rise, I rise, and then the narrative voice chooses, because obviously we can't talk about the poet, the narrative voice ends it with a full stop. That just really, that's like a power move. That is them taking full control of what they've just said. They have chosen to put that barrier in place, whereas you could argue that earlier on in the poem, it's kind of used to emphasize barriers that other people have been putting in their place, like with your bitter, twisted lies, that has an end stop line in the first stanza. But with this one, it's like, I've just said my piece and now I'm ending it. So, I just love this poem so much. It was really fun to talk about, and I hope some of the things I've talked about have helped you in some way. Oh my gosh, we're almost at, well, we're not yet, but I hope that's helped you in some way. If any IGCSE students out there, if you have any questions, please just feel free to comment, let me know. I'd be happy to answer them or help. I know I talk very fast, I'm passionate, I can't help it. I really enjoyed it, and I hope to do another video soon. I'm just having a quick look, because I've made a list of like the texts that I still have to do. Oh, okay. So I've only got one left in the fiction anthology, and that is The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. So I might do that one next. Because, don't get me wrong, I do love non-fiction. I find non-fiction texts very interesting as well. But I'm always going to have that teeny tiny little bit more appreciation for fiction. But that's just because I write myself, and that's what I enjoy. But anyway, if anyone's watched this, thank you, and I hope it's helped in some way, and I hope you all have a wonderful 2020 as well. Thank you. Bye.